I missed it for years. I would look at a face, at the way the midface loses its hold, the way cheekbones seem to drift south over decades, and I would examine the skin, examine the bone, examine the small muscles that wrap around the eye socket and the corner of the mouth. And I kept looking for the answer in the same 6 square inches where the problem appeared. That is a reasonable instinct, and it is almost entirely wrong. The reason your cheekbones are sinking has very little to do with your face. The answer is roughly 2 meters below it, in the architecture of your feet. And I want to walk you through exactly how those two structures are connected by a single unbroken sheet of living tissue. Because once you see the chain, you cannot look at facial aging the same way again. Let me start with something that has been bothering me for a long time, and I think it will bother you too once I frame it clearly. There are people, and I have seen this in my own work over and over, whose skin is healthy, whose bone density is normal, whose facial muscles test well, and whose cheekbones are still descending. The tissue is intact, the bone is intact, the muscle tone is present, and the midface is lower than it was 5 years ago. If the skin is fine, and the bone is fine, and the muscles are fine, something else is pulling the face downward. Something that is not in the face at all. That is the first question I want you to hold, and I am not going to answer it yet, because the answer only makes sense after you see 2 other things first. Here is the second thing I want you to hold. Travel anywhere in the world where daily life still involves sitting on the ground, squatting deeply, walking on uneven terrain without rigid soles, parts of rural Japan, communities across East Africa, villages in southern India, and pay attention to the faces of the people over 60. Something is different. Not dramatically different, not the kind of difference a casual tourist would notice, but the kind of difference that stops you if you have spent years studying how faces change with age. The midface holds. The cheekbones maintain their lateral projection longer. The tissue beneath the eye doesn't gather the way it does in populations that live on flat floors in cushioned shoes. These are not genetically identical populations. They live in different climates, eat different foods, carry different ancestral patterns. The variable that connects them is how they use their feet. Every single day, from childhood until death. And I find that worth paying very close attention to. Because if the variable is mechanical and not genetic, then the change is not inevitable. The change is conditional, and conditions can be altered. Hold that too. 2 open threads. I know it feels like a lot, but the payoff requires both. Now the third. Your foot contains 33 joints. 33. Your hand, which is considered one of the most complex structures in the human body, has slightly more. But your hand gets used. Your fingers type, grip, manipulate, stretch, close around a cup of coffee every morning in a slightly different configuration. Your foot's 33 joints, for most people living in industrialized societies, experience almost none of that variety. A modern shoe holds the foot in a single shape. A flat floor asks nothing of the arch. A cushioned sole absorbs the feedback that would otherwise tell the foot's nervous system how to calibrate its spring. And when 33 joints stop moving, when they spend a decade or 2 in a position that never changes, the tissue that wraps those joints shortens. It does not disappear. It does not die. It shortens, the same way any connective tissue in the body responds to immobility. The joints themselves may be capable of moving. The tissue surrounding them has tightened enough that movement becomes resistant isn't quite right. The tissue becomes reluctant. There is a difference between a joint that cannot move and a joint wrapped in tissue that has forgotten how far it used to reach. And that difference matters enormously for what happens upstream. Upstream. That word is going to do a lot of work in this conversation, because the tissue that wraps your foot's arch, the thick band along the sole, the layers that cradle the inner arch, the web of connected material that holds the spring of the foot in its loaded position, that tissue does not end at your ankle. It continues, unbroken, up the inside of your calf, along the inner line of your shin bone, through the deep compartment of your inner thigh, into the pelvic floor, through the diaphragm, up the front of your spine, along the front of your throat, and into the tissue that anchors the structures of your midface. One continuous track. No interruptions, no gaps, no transitions from one system to another. A single sheet of living material that begins in the sole of your foot and ends beneath your cheekbone. Let me try an analogy, because the scale of this connection sounds almost too convenient to be real. It is tempting to think of this fascial track the way you would think of a thread running through a garment. A long stitch connecting two distant points, pulling at one end when you tug the other. That works for about 10 seconds, and then it breaks down in a way that is more interesting than the analogy itself. A thread in a garment is passive. It transmits force in one direction, along one line, and it does not respond to the tug. The fascial track I am describing is alive. It remodels. When you shorten it from below, it does not just transmit the pull upward, it adapts to the shortened position. It lays down new collagen fibers in the shortened configuration. It remodels itself into a version that holds the shortened state as the new normal. So it is not a thread pulling a seam. It is a thread that once pulled, rebuilds the seam in the pulled position, and then resists being restored to the original length. That is why a quick stretch does not reverse decades of foot collapse. The tissue has not merely shortened, it has rewritten its own architecture to match the collapse. And that is the part the garment analogy cannot hold, and the part that explains why this process is so slow and so difficult to reverse and so easy to miss until the face itself starts to show it. Let me try the other direction. Think of the face as a scene where something has gone wrong. The kind of scene a detective walks into and starts reading for clues. The midface is lower than it should be. The tissue under the eyes has gathered. The cheekbones have lost their lateral hold. A reasonable investigator starts at the scene itself. They dust for prints on the cheekbones. They examine the skin. They catalog the muscles. And they find nothing wrong at the scene. Everything local is intact. The temptation is to conclude that the change is simply time doing what time does, an inevitable erosion. But a better investigator asks a different question. What if the scene is not where the event occurred? What if the face is not the origin of the crime, but the place where the consequences finally became visible? What if the actual event, the structural shift, the architectural collapse, happened somewhere else entirely, and the face is just the last address on the chain of custody? That reframe changes everything about where you look and what you look for. Except here is where this analogy breaks too. And the breaking point is the most important part. In forensics, the evidence at the crime scene is static. The scene does not continue to deform while you are investigating it. The body's fascial system does. The tissue is alive, actively remodeling, actively adapting to the pull from below, even as you are trying to examine the changes at the top. The scene is still being altered by the event, in real time, right now, while you are watching this. That is not how crime scenes work. And that is exactly why the forensic frame, while useful for a moment, ultimately misleads you about one critical fact. This is not a cold case. This is an active one. The pull from below has not stopped. It is happening right now, at whatever rate your foot's architecture dictates, and the face is responding to it at this exact moment. 33 joints, one continuous track. Your foot is the foundation, and the foundation is the one thing almost nobody examines when the face starts changing. The chain runs like this, and I want you to understand each station because each one either transmits the collapse upward or absorbs it, and which one it does in your body determines exactly how your face responds. The inner arch of the foot is the starting point. When that arch collapses, and collapse is a gradient, not a binary. Some arches lose 10% of their height, some lose 40. The tissue that supports it shortens along the sole and then continues shortening up the inside of the lower leg. Your inner calf muscle, the one that sits deep behind the shin bone, is wrapped in this tissue. When the arch drops, that inner calf tissue tightens, not because the muscle is overworking, but because the fascial wrap around it has shortened from below and is now holding the muscle in a compressed state. That compression changes how the ankle moves, which changes how the knee tracks, which changes how the inner thigh loads. The inner thigh, the muscles along the inside of your leg from knee to pelvis, sits inside the same fascial plane. When the tissue below it tightens, the inner thigh responds by shortening its own resting length. And when the inner thigh shortens, it pulls on the floor of the pelvis. Not the bony pelvis, the soft floor, the hammock of tissue that spans the base of the pelvis, the one that supports everything above it, responds to the pull from below by increasing its tension. And a tense pelvic floor does not stay isolated. It connects directly to the tissue that wraps the diaphragm, the breathing muscle that separates your chest from your abdomen. A tense pelvic floor limits how far the diaphragm can descend. A limited diaphragm changes the pressure dynamics in the chest and throat. The tissue in front of the throat, the deep fascial layer that runs from the collarbone up along the front of the cervical spine, responds to the altered pressure by shortening. And the tissue at the front of the throat connects without interruption to the deep fascial layer of the midface, the tissue that holds your cheekbones in their lateral position, that supports the fat pads beneath your eyes, that maintains the structural integrity of the midface as an architectural unit. One chain, foot to face, each station a domino. And the first domino fell the year you stopped using your feet. This single exercise, the one I am about to show you for the foot arch, addresses the foundation of that chain. The complete sequence, all 12 release positions ordered from the ground upward to the face, with labeled diagrams showing exactly where to place your hands at each station and how long to hold each one, that is what I built the Connected Face protocol for. It is in the description below this video if you want the full system. For now, let me give you the foundation, because the foundation is where this begins and where most people have never thought to look. The revelation that took me too long to reach, and the reason I'm spending this much time with you on it, is that the cheekbone does not sink. Nothing about the bone itself changes in most people. The bone is not dissolving, not reabsorbing, not thinning in the way that a long bone might after decades of disuse. The cheekbone is being pulled, slowly, steadily, millimeter by millimeter, by the tissue beneath it that connects to the tissue beneath that, all the way down to a foot that stopped moving the way it was designed to move. The cheekbone is not failing. The system is operating exactly as designed. Continuous tissue transmits force across the whole structure. And when the force from below changes, the structure above changes with it. The face is doing precisely what it should do in response to what is happening 2 meters lower. And that means if you change what happens at the bottom, the top responds. But if the chain is one piece, why does the face change last? Why not the knee or the hip or the rib cage? Why is the cheekbone the final symptom instead of the first? The reason is sequential, and it follows the same logic as water finding its way downhill, except in this case, the pull moves upward, and it moves at the speed of tissue remodeling, which is months and years, not minutes and hours. The foot collapses first because the foot bears the most load and the least attention. The inner calf adapts next because it is closest to the origin of the shortening. The inner thigh follows. The pelvic floor follows. The diaphragm follows. The throat follows. And the midface, the very last station on the ascending chain, changes last because it is the farthest from the origin and because the forces transmitted to it are the most diluted, the most gradual, the most incremental. Each station between the foot and the face absorbs some of the pull. Not all of it. None of them absorb all of it, but each one takes a percentage. And by the time the remaining force reaches the midface, it is a slow, persistent tug that produces visible change over 5 years, not 5 weeks. That is why you do not feel it happening. That is why no mirror reveals the process. The face changes at a rate below the threshold of daily perception, and by the time the change is visible, by the time someone looks at a photograph from 4 years ago and thinks something shifted, the entire chain has already remodeled itself into the shortened configuration. Let me take you somewhere. Okinawa, southern Japan, where the traditional way of living, and I mean the generation that grew up before Western furniture became standard, involves sitting on tatami, squatting to cook, kneeling for meals, walking on uneven forest paths and rocky shorelines in thin-soled sandals or bare feet. The feet in that population, in that generation, did not stop moving. 33 joints, loaded and unloaded thousands of times a day in configurations that a modern athletic shoe would never permit. And the faces of that generation's elders carry a quality that is difficult to name without sounding imprecise. So let me be precise about what I mean. The midface maintains its height. The cheekbones retain their lateral position relative to the orbital rim. The tissue beneath the eyes does not descend into the soft pockets that are so common in populations where shoes and flat floors are universal. The skin ages, wrinkles appear, elasticity decreases, sun damage accumulates, but the architecture holds. The scaffold stays up. That is not genetics. Okinawans who moved to urban environments and adopted modern footwear and flat floor living patterns show midface changes indistinguishable from any other industrialized population. The variable is not blood. The variable is the floor, the shoe, and the 33 joints. Go to Kenya's Rift Valley. Pastoral communities where walking 10, 15, 20 kilometers a day on uneven terrain in minimal footwear is not exercise, but daily life. The feet are wide, the arches are dynamic. They load and unload with every step over every rock and root and slope. And the facial structure of people in their 60s and 70s holds in a way that does not match the predictions you would make based on sun exposure, nutrition, or healthcare access. The midface maintains. Go to rural Tamil Nadu, where squatting is the default resting position, where the deep squat, heels down, spine long, the entire posterior chain lengthened and the entire anterior chain open is how people wait for a bus, prepare food, have a conversation. The feet in those positions are working constantly. The arches loading and releasing in patterns that would exhaust a foot trapped in a rigid shoe. And the faces above those feet carry their structure in ways that challenge the assumption that midface descent is simply what time does to every human body. I am not romanticizing these cultures. Every population has its health challenges, its structural compromises, its environmental costs. What I am pointing out is a mechanical variable that produces a measurable anatomical outcome. And the variable is foot use. Not foot exercise, foot use. The distinction matters. Exercise is something you add to your day in a discrete block of time. Use is how your feet function during the other 23 hours and 40 minutes when you are not doing your toe spreading routine. A foot that gets 15 minutes of mobility work and then spends the rest of the day in a rigid shoe on a flat floor is a foot that gets 15 minutes of input in 23 hours of the signal that says do not move, do not adapt, do not spring, do not remodel. Let me tell you what I see. Not a single case, what I see as a pattern, accumulated over years of looking at the same chain in different bodies. The feet come in first in my assessment because the feet always tell me what the face is going to say before the face says it. A foot with a collapsed inner arch, shortened toe flexors, rigid ankle dorsiflexion. That foot tells me the deep front line is short. And when I look at the face above that foot, the midface has descended. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it is 2 millimeters. 2 millimeters of cheekbone descent does not sound like much until you realize that 2 millimeters changes the shadow line beneath the eye, changes the perceived fullness of the midface, changes the way light hits the lateral cheek. 2 millimeters of architectural descent produces a visual change that people interpret as 5 years of aging. And the origin of those 2 millimeters is in the sole of the foot, in an arch that lost 15% of its height over a decade of disuse. The weight of seeing this pattern, and I want to be honest about what it feels like to see this, is a strange combination of frustration and tenderness. Frustration because the connection is right there, in the anatomy, visible to anyone who traces the tissue from bottom to top. and yet it is almost never the first thing investigated when someone is concerned about their face. And tenderness, because the people I see have been caring for their faces with extraordinary diligence. The creams, the serums, the massage techniques, the facial exercises. They have been attending to the scene of the change with real commitment and real hope. And the change continues because the origin of the change is not at the scene. It is 2 meters below, in a part of the body that nobody told them to look at. And there is something genuinely moving about watching someone discover that the thing they have been fighting is not a failure of their face, but a consequence of their feet. And that the solution is not more attention to the face, but more attention to the ground. Here's what to do about it. And the answer depends on what your foot is doing right now, because not every foot has collapsed in the same way. And the correction that helps one type of collapse can aggravate another. If your inner arch has dropped, and you can check this by looking at the inside of your foot while standing, if the highest point of the arch is less than a finger's width from the floor, the arch has descended significantly, then the first intervention is restoring the intrinsic muscles of the foot that support the arch from below. Sit with your foot flat on the floor. Without curling your toes, try to shorten the distance between the ball of your foot and your heel by drawing the arch upward. Your toes stay long and flat on the ground. The movement is small, maybe a centimeter of lift. Hold that contraction for 5 seconds. Release for 3. Repeat 10 times. This is not a stretch, it is a muscle activation. The muscles that support the inner arch have been dormant, and waking them takes repetition, not force. Do this seated, barefoot, every morning for 2 weeks before progressing. What you should feel is a cramping sensation along the inner sole. That cramping is the recruitment of tissue that has been structurally unemployed. If your toes curl or grip the floor, you are using the wrong muscles. The toes must stay passive while the arch lifts. If your arch is rigid rather than collapsed, if the inner arch is high but immobile, if it does not flatten when you load it with weight, the problem is different. A rigid arch does not absorb force. It transmits all of it upward without the cushioning effect of a dynamic spring. For a rigid arch, the intervention is mobilization, not strengthening. Place a small ball, a lacrosse ball, or a tennis ball under the sole of your foot, just in front of the heel, and let your body weight press the foot into the ball. Slowly roll the ball forward toward the base of the toes over 30 seconds, pausing wherever you feel a point of particular resistance. That resistance is tissue that is stiffened into a rigid configuration. The pressure from the ball is not breaking the tissue, it is signaling the nervous system to reduce the protective tone that is holding the tissue rigid. 3 passes, sole to toes, 30 seconds each, once daily. If the sensation is sharp rather than dull, reduce your body weight on the ball by sitting rather than standing. If your foot shows elements of both, a partially dropped arch that is also stiff in certain ranges, combine the 2 approaches. Mobilize first with the ball for 90 seconds, then activate the arch lifting contraction for 10 repetitions. The mobilization repairs the tissue. The activation retrains the neural pattern. The order matters. Activation without mobilization recruits muscles into a stiff environment where they cannot produce their full range. Mobilization without activation releases tissue that then has no muscular support to hold the new range. Once the foot has been addressed, and I mean 2 to 3 weeks of daily attention, not a single session, the chain above it needs releasing at each station. The inner calf. Sit with one leg crossed so the inner calf of your lower leg rests on the opposite knee. Let the weight of your leg press the inner calf tissue into the bony ridge of the opposite knee, and slowly slide the lower leg forward and backward to move the pressure along the length of the inner calf. 2 minutes per side. The sensation should be strong, but not sharp. You are compressing the deep fascial compartment that has been shortened by the foot's collapse, and the compression signals the tissue to release its protective tension. The inner thigh. Sit on the floor with the sole of one foot pressed against the opposite inner thigh, your knee out to the side. Lean forward gently from the hips, not rounding the spine, but hinging at the pelvis, until you feel a deep stretch along the inner line of the extended leg, from knee to groin. Hold for 90 seconds. Do not bounce, do not push into pain. The deep front line through the inner thigh responds to sustained, gentle load over time. Short, aggressive stretches trigger a protective reflex that tightens the tissue further. The pelvic floor and diaphragm. Lie on your back with your knees bent, feet flat on the floor, and place one hand on your lower belly and one hand on your lower rib cage. Breathe in through your nose and direct the breath downward. The hand on your belly should rise before the hand on your rib cage. As you exhale slowly through your mouth, allow both hands to descend without muscular effort. The exhale should take 6 to 8 seconds. Repeat for 10 breath cycles. What you are doing is restoring the descending excursion of the diaphragm, which is limited when the pelvic floor is tense from below. The slow exhale releases the pelvic floor. The directed inhale trains the diaphragm to descend fully. When the diaphragm descends fully, the pressure in the chest and throat normalizes, and the fascial tissue along the front of the throat has room to lengthen. The anterior throat. Sit upright and gently tilt your head backward, looking at the ceiling. Place 2 fingertips lightly on the front of your throat, just above the collarbone. And as you tilt the head back, feel the tissue beneath your fingers lengthen. Hold the tilt for 15 seconds, breathing normally through your nose. Return your head to neutral for 5 seconds. Repeat 5 times. The tissue along the front of the throat is the second to last station on the chain before the midface. And when it releases, the pull on the midface decreases directly. You may feel a sensation of warmth or mild pulsation under your fingertips. That is, increased blood flow into tissue that has been compressed. Each of these stations, foot, inner calf, inner thigh, pelvic floor, diaphragm, anterior throat, is a link in the same continuous track. And the tissue at each station has been remodeling itself into a shortened position for however many years your foot has been immobile. Restoring the chain is not a weekend project. The tissue needs time to remodel in the opposite direction, laying down collagen fibers in the lengthened configuration, gradually replacing the shortened architecture with one that allows the chain to carry its tension upward without compressing the structures at the top. The timeline is measured in months, and I need to be specific about that because the alternative, expecting a visible change in the midface after 3 days of toe exercises, sets up a disappointment that leads people to abandon the approach before the tissue has had time to respond. 4 to 6 weeks for the foot to regain measurable arch mobility. 6 to 10 weeks for the inner calf and thigh tissue to remodel enough that the pelvic floor tension decreases. 8 to 14 weeks before the diaphragm's excursion improves enough to reduce the compression along the throat. And somewhere around the 12 to 16 week mark, the cumulative release along the chain reaches the midface, and the tissue that has been pulling the cheekbones downward begins to lengthen and release its hold. I describe that timeline carefully, not to discourage you, but to earn your trust, because a shorter timeline would be a lie. And I think this particular piece of information deserves the kind of honesty that takes more words, not fewer. The body remodels connective tissue at its own pace, and that pace is set by biology, not by enthusiasm or discipline. 4 months is not a long time in the life of your face. It is not even a long time in the life of your feet. It is the kind of timeline that gets lost inside the ordinary rhythm of a season changing. And one morning in the 4th month, you look at a mirror and something is different. Not transformed, not 20 years younger, not any of the exaggerated promises that circulate in this space, but different. The midface has shifted. The cheekbone shadow has changed. The tissue beneath the eye sits higher by a margin that is small and absolutely real. Let me return to the cultural thread because it resolves into something more tender than I expected when I first started tracing it. The populations I mentioned in Okinawa, in Kenya's Rift Valley, in southern India, are not performing special facial exercises. They are not applying protocols or following sequences or setting timers on their phones. They are living in a way that maintains the chain from foot to face as a byproduct of daily life. The squatting, the walking on uneven ground, the barefoot contact with surfaces that demand the foot's 33 joints actually articulate. These are not interventions. They are how human beings moved for 100,000 years before we invented the flat floor and the cushioned shoe and the chair. The chain from foot to face was never meant to collapse. It collapses because we removed the environmental inputs that maintained it. And the tissue did what tissue always does in the absence of movement. It shortened, it stiffened, it remodeled into the position of least demand. What those cultures preserve is not a secret or a technique. It is the default. We are the ones who departed from it. And that is a bittersweet observation, because you cannot undo industrialization, and you should not want to. The flat floor and the cushioned shoe exist because they solve real problems: cold surfaces, sharp objects, joint protection during extended standing. The solution is not to abandon modern life, but to reintroduce, deliberately and specifically, the mechanical inputs that modern life eliminated. The exercises I described are not a replacement for the way those populations use their feet. They are a focused attempt to provide, in 15 minutes a day, a fraction of the stimulus that 33 joints would receive over a full day of ground-level living on uneven terrain. That fraction is enough. Not because it fully replicates the ancestral pattern, but because connective tissue is extraordinarily responsive to consistent stimulus, and even a modest amount of the right input, applied daily, triggers a remodeling process that the tissue is desperate to complete. The chain wants to lengthen. The tissue is not resisting you. It is waiting for a signal it has not received in years. What I have witnessed, and this is the part that stays with me longest after each clinic day closes, is not a single case, but a pattern accumulated over enough repetitions that the pattern itself becomes a kind of quiet evidence. Feet open. Arches lift by degrees so small they need measurement, not mirrors. Inner calves release their grip. Hips gain internal rotation they had lost. Breath deepens. In faces, slowly, over months that the person is not counting because they have stopped watching their face in the mirror the way they used to, because they are paying attention to their feet instead, faces shift. The midface lifts. Not because someone pulled it upward, because the tissue that was pulling it downward finally let go, and the structure returned, partially, toward the position it was designed to hold. That is where loop one closes, the question I asked you to hold at the beginning. Why do cheekbones sink in people whose skin and bone and muscles are healthy? Because the cheekbone was never sinking on its own. It was being pulled by a chain that originates in the foot, runs through 7 stations of continuous tissue, and terminates in the scaffold that holds the midface in place. The skin is healthy because the skin was never the problem. The bone is intact because the bone was never failing. The muscles test well because the muscles are not the mechanism. The mechanism is fascial, it is architectural, it is whole body, and it begins in the 33 joints that nobody thought to examine when the face started changing. If you found yourself somewhere in this, if the chain I described sounds like something happening in your own body, and if the exercises I walked through feel like something worth testing in your own morning, I would be grateful if you let me know in the comments what you notice over the first 2 weeks, because the early changes are always in the feet, not the face. And hearing what you feel in those first 14 days helps me understand which part of the chain is tightest in the population watching this. And if the way I explain these connections resonates with how you want to understand your own body as a connected system rather than a collection of isolated parts, then subscribing means these conversations continue, and each one traces a different chain through the same architecture. Here is the ritual. Toothbrush down in the morning, that is your trigger. Before you leave the bathroom, barefoot on the tile, lift your arches 10 times without curling your toes, 5 seconds each. That is 50 seconds. Then tilt your head back gently and hold for 15 seconds, feeling the front of your throat lengthen. Total time, 65 seconds. The toothbrush is the anchor. The arch lift and the throat release are the bookends of the chain. Every morning. The tissue between those 2 points will begin responding within the first month, and it will continue responding for as long as you continue asking it to. The face was never the first place to look. The people who understand the chain, the ones who kneel on the floor and walk on rough ground and let their feet be feet, they never needed to look at the face at all because they never stopped maintaining the structure that holds it. That is who this is for. The person who is willing to look 2 meters below the mirror to find what the mirror cannot show them. And if you remember nothing else from this conversation, remember the 33 joints in your foot that stopped moving, in the single unbroken sheet of tissue that carried their silence all the way to your cheekbones. The answer was always 2 meters below, in the architecture you were standing on the entire time.